And now we're lucky to have Beth Conrey with us today, who'll be presenting. She is the co-founder and co-chair of PPAN. She's also on the board of the Pollinator Stewardship Council. She's the former president of the Western Apicultural Society, the Colorado State Beekeepers Association, and of the Northern Colorado Beekeepers Association. Beth is owner of Bee Squared Apiaries. It's a chemical-free 100 hive. Maybe there's more than that, Beth. You'll have to correct me if I'm wrong. Beekeeping business in Berthoud. And she produces amazing honey, beeswax candles, and soaps as well. So welcome to Beth. And I'm going to let her take this away for this magical journey into the swarm.
Thanks, Joyce. I appreciate it. So yes, the magic of swarms. And because it is swarm season, you're absolutely correct. There are more than just 100 hives on the ground right now. We're sitting at about 130. So first we count up and then we count back. But it is an exciting time of year. It's one of my favorite times of year, and it is a truly magical time of year. So let's get started with further ado and talk about what on earth a swarm is. And here are some photos of other insects that swarm. Okay, so it's not just honeybees that swarm. These on the left-hand side are ants, and then on the right-hand side are ladybugs. And if you've ever had the opportunity to see either of those, you certainly would remember them also. I saw a ladybug swarm once. I was a kid. I was probably in second or third grade, and I lived in Maryland. And I went outside during recess, and there was this stump that was probably 18 inches around and 2-3 foot tall, and it was red. And it was red with all of the ladybird beetles that were swarming on it at that time. And somewhere I was at the Phoenix airport, and they had done this photography exhibit. And this photography exhibit had this talking about the red ant migration, which is not exactly a swarm, but the velvet ants. And I guess they look like an artery through the desert. You can see them from the air. There's so many of them when they migrate. So super cool. So swarms is just a whole bunch of insects on the move. And it is the way that honeybees naturally reproduce. So this is what a honeybee swarm looks like. It is a whole pile of bees. They are all congregated on a branch, although that's not necessarily where they will stay or what they will always congregate on. The old queen departs the hive, and then they hatch out a new young queen. And essentially where there was one, there is now two. So it's a divide and conquer mentality that's going on in the springtime. So why? This is how they reproduce the colony. The queen has run out of room. I was telling Joyce and Sabina before everybody got let into the room that I had a 13.5-pound swarm come off of one of my hives the other day, which is about 50,000 bees. And then I opened up the hive, and you can't figure out where 50,000 bees came from, much less why there's 50,000 still left in there. It's amazing how fast they can reproduce. And when she runs out of laying space, that's the trigger that says, okay, we got to go. We don't have any more room in the apartment complex. It's time to get a new apartment. Typically, the first swarm is the one that leaves with the original queen from the hive. It is the largest swarm by far. 3 to 10 pounds is what it says here. I just told you that one was 13.5. That was a big swarm. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And I've caught a lot of swarms. Typically, the average is about 3 pounds. And it looks like a football when it's sitting in a tree. And then you get some things called after swarms. And these are swarms that leave with these newly hatched queens that they put out the door approximately 8 days after the prime swarm departs. And these are generally much smaller. And if you are a beekeeper, then you know that it's the inverse ratio, that the bigger it is, the further away and the higher and more miserable it is to catch. And the smaller it is, the easier it is to grab. So I had a virgin queen swarm come off this morning at one of my south yards, and she probably weighed in at about a half a pound. 15 foot straight up in the air. He had a nice 15-foot ladder, put it right underneath her, popped her in a box. Everything was all done. We'll talk about that here in a second. But why would I go out there and catch a little swarm like that? Well, because there's a new, fresh, viable queen in there, and there's value to that into my beekeeping operation. Okay, so how do we know when a hive is going to swarm? Well, the first major clue is this right here: a successfully overwintered colony. This is why it's so critical to keep bees alive in the wintertime. And when we see this data that comes out that says that we're losing 50% of our bees annually, this is where it really starts to hurt. The whole cycle gets broken with these winter losses. So having a successfully overwintered colony will almost guarantee a swarm in the spring. In Colorado, we can start going on high alert typically April 15th. And that is what I call first gear. And then done long about now, we are in as good a swarm season as we get. Well, for any of you who have been paying any attention to the weather, you know that April 15th was not warm. May 1st wasn't particularly warm. There was snow somewhere around Mother's Day. Okay, so we are not on this schedule this year. I would say that this is the first week where we've had consistent weather for swarm behavior. And we have had a few swarm calls come in. We know that they have got to have a ton of food available for them to swarm also. And bees need both nectar and pollen to survive. Nectar is a carbohydrate and pollen is a protein. And pollen is baby food. So when they're rearing lots of brood, they are using lots of pollen. And then finally, we've got that queen who has laid enough eggs for an army, and there is no more room in that hive. So the hive senses this, and I should backtrack a little bit to say that honeybees are colony insects. And so colony insects are fairly unique in the world. There's only 3 colony insects, and that is termites, ants, and honeybees. And so when a honeybee hive sets about to do something, they do it via consensus. And the way that the decision making is through the hive is by pheromones. So the decision by the hive that they have run out of room and it's time to get out of there, and they are going to construct swarm cells, which are the new replacement queens. And the day that that cell is capped is the day that the swarm emanates. So if you look at this picture, you can see in the shadow, actually easier than you can see in the shot, that little top, the lid of that swarm cell that has been opened up, chewed out by that queen, and she has emerged. So this is this peanut-shaped shell. This is exactly what it looks like. Some of them are huge, some of them are smaller. Some, when I opened up that hive that had the 13-pound swarm, there was 14 of these hatched cells in there. So they do not put all their eggs in one basket. They will put them in multiple baskets. In the hive next door to that, I was rearing out some queens off of a frame, and there were 5 queen cells that had hatched, and I was able to find 3 of the queens that did not make it, as well as the queen that was the survival of the fittest queen, the one that survived and stayed in there. So on day 8 is when this queen cell is capped, and then on day 16 is the day that the queen that's inside this cell hatches, and then they will anytime she has to harden off her exoskeleton a bit, and then she has to go on a mating flight, and so there can be after swarms several days after this, and there could be multiple. I mean, if we have 10 queen cells in there, we might have 5 of these little after swarms that come out of there in that subsequent week. So I already said that the April 15th to June 15th is the primary time when swarms happen. The heaviest swarm period is from May 15th to June 15th, and I would say we're lagging at least a week and maybe closer to 2 weeks on this time frame, but that's just the general rule is May 15th to June 15th. 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. is prime time. Nobody swarms at 8 o'clock in the morning. Nobody swarms at 8 o'clock at night. They swarm during the midday, and they will almost always swarm on calm days with little to no wind. They do not like wind at all. And then when we have warm days, preceding cold days is actually prime swarm weather. So we had a little bout of cold there, and we kind of opened up the floodgates this week with respect to swarms, at least as far as my hives are concerned. Sometimes you'll hear where people will say that they had a swarm and there's no bees left in their hive. And that isn't a swarm, that's an absconsion. And that means that they did not divide and conquer. That means they decided that the home that they had been provided, whether it was in a tree or in a managed hive, was unacceptable for some reason. And whatever that reason is, they've decided they're not going to live with it, and they choose to just vacate the property. So absconsions do occur in managed hives, typically when beekeepers are installing newly purchased bees from something called a package into a new hive. And that new hive really doesn't have what a colony is looking for in terms of resources. And so you have to kind of sweeten the deal when you put them into a hive. And sometimes what you think is good enough, they don't. And that's when you lose them, is likely on a package installation. Okay, where do swarms happen? Well, here's pretty much a classic looking swarm right here that's in a tree. Here's another one right here. You can see I've set up a hive box here, and it's right next to this swarm that's on this fence. And they are quite commonly on fences and fence posts. I love this one. It looks like one of those little cartoon characters for kids, but that's clearly on a fire hydrant. And we get them on bikes, we get them on car mirrors, there's just a ton of places that they go to, which underlines sort of the decision-making process that happens when a swarm occurs, and that is none. They are just pell-mell flying all over like a bee tornado when they emanate from the hive. And again, this is pheromone driven. And so that queen, she's been laying eggs for a year. She's kind of fat because she hangs out in the hive all day, doesn't fly around for a living. She lays eggs for a living. So the hive will trim her up a little bit, but she's still not a particularly capable flyer. And so she just lands on the first thing that looks like a pretty good spot, and then everybody else piles on top of her. And that's why we have this a variety of spaces that's selected. So the question is, how do we catch a swarm? And for anybody who's serious about swarm catching, we have a variety of tools in our toolbox to catch a swarm. But essentially, we set up this hive body that you see in this left-hand picture, and then we whack the branch. And I'm going to play a little video. As you can see, I've got a box set up right underneath these girls. I'm going to shake that branch, and hopefully they'll all fall in that box, like what they find, and stay put. Okay, as you can see, we've got some motion here. There's a hole in this top of this inner cover, and all of the bees are starting to fan their wings and point towards that hole. They're letting all the other bees know via pheromone communication that this is where their mother went to. And finally, we'll do the last video. And as you can see, there are no more bees in the shrub, and all the bees are in the hive. Ta-da! And really, seriously, sometimes it is that simple. So there can be very few bees in a swarm, or there can be huge swarms out there. And people always want to know how many bees in a swarm. So if you look at that left-hand swarm, that's actually, I took that picture in Mexico. And so these are probably Africanized bees. And there's probably 100 in there if there's that many. This is a very, very small swarm, about the size of a baseball. The whopper on the right, however, is what a 13-pound swarm looks like. So that is one from my beehives here in Berthoud. And so that will run, that's about a 50,000 bee swarm. I've heard tale of swarms that are larger than that. I've never seen one myself, but these 13 to 15 pounds I see 1 to 2 a year. And it's astounding how many bees are in there, but that's roughly 50,000 bees in there. And then the other question that people ask all the time is, how do we know if I have the queen? The queen is whose pheromone everyone is following when they form up into an actual swarm. But if you look at this photo, it's super obvious that all of these bees that are located on this inner cover are all pointing their heads towards that notch, and then they all have their rumps up in the air. And inside their abdomens, they have something called a Nasonov gland. And that Nasonov gland releases another pheromone. It's a very distinctive pheromone. It's really a swarm pheromone. Swarms have their own particular smell. And when the bees perform this behavior, they are telling all the bees that are flying in the air that this is where their mother is. And so if you think like a bee and you are 20 foot up above this is like runway lights for you. It absolutely lets you know that this is where you need to be going if you want to be with your mother. So it's a pretty effective tool. There is a gentleman who's done a considerable amount of research on swarms, and his name is Dr. Tom Seeley, and he's out of Cornell University. And if you were to look up any of his books, he's got a whole tribe of them on bees and bee behavior, but he's pretty clever. And so he has one called Honeybee Democracy that's kind of actually made I want to say it made like the bestseller list. It's a pick up, put down book. It's written by chapters, but like I say, he's kind of clever. And so what he did was he wanted to see if the bees could figure out where the queen went to if he glued their Nasanov gland shut. And they could, but it took them a whole lot longer to communicate where that queen was than with this effective Nasanov scent release that they have displayed here in this photo. Okay. People always want to know if swarms are dangerous. And no, by and large, they are not dangerous. That doesn't mean that there isn't somebody in there that gets accidentally stung when they are in the middle of an actual swarm on the move. But it's important to remember that honeybees are defensive, not aggressive. And because they are defensive, they are not defensive in a swarm because they have no house, they have no food, and they have no brood that they are defending. So it is quite the wager for a swarm to take off. Because if they don't find adequate lodging, they start dying because they don't have any food. They need to be inside a place. So it's a big bet if you think about it, to leave in the swarm. But obviously, it's a successful bet because honeybees have been swarming for millennia, and they wouldn't do it if it was unsuccessful. So bear that in mind. Are they disconcerting? Heck yeah, they're disconcerting. And I was hoping that I could actually replace this video, but if you turn your volume up on your whatever you're viewing this presentation in as high as you possibly can. I've got mine as high as I possibly can too, but see if you can hear what happens when the swarm is on the move. And so let me start this little video for you. So that's the whirling vortex of bees, okay? It's a tornado of bees. And if you look, you can see that they are gathering on that tree trunk behind there. And now you can see that they're starting to really pile up on that tree. It's hard to discern that there's actually less in the air, but there are less in the air. And when all is said and done, they will form a giant pile on that tree. And I think I actually have it for the next photo. So we'll go, it's enough looking and listening to swarms. And let's go to the next slide. Okay, so once that swarm has formed up onto a tree branch or the bicycle or the car or whatever it lands on, then what we want to do is capture that swarm and put it into a managed hive. If nobody sees that swarm, at some point it will move itself into a permanent home. And that point is the point at which the hive forms a consensus, and I'll talk about it here in a second. A permanent home, according to Dr. Seeley, has a whole bunch of different parameters in terms of height from the ground, the direction that the hole faces, et cetera, et cetera. And so mostly honeybees will move into tree cavities. But in the absence of mature trees with cavities, they move into homes. And in particular, they move into soffits and they move into deck support posts. Most of those guys that are building houses put up a 4x4 post with a 16-inch surround on it. That's usually made of stucco or of stone. And the gap between that 4-inch post and that 16-inch surround is just perfect for a honeybee colony. And now we don't have a swarm anymore. We actually have a colony that's taken up residence. So we really don't like that in urban environments. We like swarms to be in managed hives, as colonies in managed hives. So please, if you see a swarm, don't let it sit there and leave on its own. Call the swarm hotline, which I will put up on the display here, and report that swarm so that we can come get it before it moves into a structure. And then instead of being free for us to pick it up, it is now going to be a fee because we need somebody who understands something about construction to get them out of where they're at. So when the swarm piles up, it sends out these scout bees. And the scout bees are responsible for finding suitable permanent dwellings for the swarm to move into to establish a colony. And so they will go out in all different directions from the swarm and they will assess all of the sites that they find for these parameters of height and whole location, and volume is actually the biggest criterion of space, a number of bees that they can hold. And once the scouts find some locations, they will come back to the swarm and they will go to the dance floor. And I think probably most of you have heard about the bee dances that bees do to tell the colony where food sources are. But they also do a dance that tells the colony where a possible home is. And so they come onto the dance floor and they extol all the virtues of this house. And then another scout bee will get on the dance floor and she'll extol all the virtues of where she sees the house and how, what that looks like. And they are trying to convince all the rest of the bees in that swarm that the place that they have selected is better. And there's quite serious negotiation that transpires during the course of this. And in the end, they reach consensus where the one recruiter quits recruiting and throws in her cards with the other one that's been recruiting. And there can be multiples, but in the end, there'll be just one. And then at that point, the swarm dissolves and carries off to their permanent home. So we like to shorten that period from when they emanate to when they find a permanent residence. And we do that by catching the swarm when it's in its swarm state. So here is that number that I threatened you with earlier. So if you are lucky enough to see a swarm, and it really is luck, it is one of nature's great migrations, and it's astounding to see. It's astounding to hear. It is astounding to smell. You will never forget it when it happens. And if you see a swarm, then call the swarm hotline. So that is the toll-free number that we established for swarm calls in the state. And then alternatively, you can call in Boulder County, you can call the swarm hotline, which lives in my right rear pocket, at 970-213-3099. Either one of those will work. And a little reminder that it's free. It's a public service of the Colorado State Beekeepers Association and all of the associated local associations, which in my case is Boulder County Beekeepers Association. Don't do any of these things. Swarms are super valuable and represent the bees that are able to survive and thrive in this area. So they're great stock. So don't spray them with water. Don't spray them with an insecticide. I actually had somebody set a swarm on fire, so that is why it's on there. If you call an exterminator because you can't remember the swarm hotline, that's the only reason you would do that. They are going to give you my number or the 800 number because exterminators do not kill swarms. And don't stress about your kids and your animals too much. Okay, we do not have Africanized bees here in Colorado, so these bees are just looking for a new home. And kids and animals know that that thing in the tree making all that buzzing sound is not something they want to go up and poke. So they will leave it alone, and you can rest assured that if you give them a little bit of a berth, everything will be just fine. And that is pretty much everything I've got to say about swarms today. So at this point, I'm ready to open up chat and respond to this list of things that people have asked.
And Beth, I'm just going to jump in and say thanks so much. I'm so excited that your videos worked this time. They
cool. Yeah.
turned out great. This was a fun and interesting presentation. And it looks like we will have time to get to all the questions I'm seeing so far. And I've been monitoring the chat so I can rattle them off to you. I do just want to make one more plug to consider making a donation to PPAN before we get on to the questions. And you can do that on our website at peopleandpollinators.org. I'll plug that into the chat in a moment. And if you did sign up for this webinar, you will be on our email list now. And our email is always packed with lots of information about pollinators and biodiversity and upcoming events and volunteer opportunities. And let's see. So let me just work my way through some of these if you want me to read them off to you, Beth.
Yeah, I've got the chat on my screen here.
Okay, great.
I'll just go ahead and do you guys want me on the screen? Or do you just want the thank you page up there? Because I can stop the screen share and
why don't you come up and show your face? I haven't been able to today, guys, but now,
okay,
now we are. Here we go.
Okay, super. All right. So Claire has got a question, and that question is: if there are multiple queen cells, does the swarm take off when the first queen cell is capped, or when most of the queen cells are capped? Good question. I would say that they're all sort of simultaneous and simultaneously being built, so that the capping is kind of simultaneous too. So that I think that once it's capped is when the prime swarm, and I would say that the difference in time between the first cell is capped and when the last cell is capped is probably not more than a few hours. So I don't know that much matters. I could be wrong on that. It's a good question, but I think that it's probably doesn't really matter for the purposes of the swarm, whether it's the first or the last cell, because it's such a short window in between when they cap the first and when they cap the last. And then the second part is, I heard when the queen starts piping in her queen cell is when the swarm may take off. That is incorrect. Okay, so the queen is not piping in her queen cell on the prime swarm, because this is the mated queen, the old queen that is leaving. So this is correct. I wouldn't even say it's correct for that. I would say that the queen that is piping is the one that's going to hatch first. And for those of you, which would probably be most of you, have never heard a queen pipe. And it refers to this little noise that the queen makes when she's getting ready to emerge. These virgin queens are getting ready to emerge. And this is what it sounds like. Like somebody's blowing on a piece of grass. Okay, it's just this. It's quite soft, very distinctive, and when you hear it, you know that a queen is imminently popping out of a queen cell. And so it can be quite fun at that instant because you can grab a bunch of the ones that aren't hatched yet and actually start new hives with them because he won't have killed them yet. But the swarm does not take off when the queen is piping in her queen cell, okay? Because she still has to harden off her exoskeleton so that she can go with them. So this is the virgin swarm. This is the after swarm, and it will occur sometime within the next few days after those virgin queens all hatch. And then the second part of that question is when the bees start building queen cells to when they swarm is generally 8 days. Okay, so it is the day that the queen cells are capped is how long it takes from when they start building them to when they depart. Okay, next question. All right, this is a cool thing. Yes. Okay, so Jody asks, in the last few years, I've been blessed with 2 swarms in my backyard. Did they like to come back to the same spot to swarm? So I mentioned this, that at my house, that they always swarm into my shrub line. And every so often I'll actually have like this rogue element that goes out of the shrub line and goes into the rose bush or someplace 10 feet in a different direction. But they leave a pheromone trail, and that pheromone trail is obviously holds up over the course of years. So yes, if somebody is keeping a managed hive near you, or you have a tree that has a colony inside there, you can expect that colony in both situations to return to the same spot year after year, which if you think about that's pretty funky. 2 swarms this month in your front yard. So this is the same thing. So you probably had the first primary. It depends on, you should clarify what you had going on this one, Shauna, whether you had 2 of them sort of back to back, or if you had 2 of them about 10 days apart. Because if you had 2 of them back to back, then those would be 2 swarms with virgin queens in them. But if you had them about 10 days apart, then it would be the prime swarm followed by the after swarm or virgin queen swarm. Okay. Okay. Kate asks, do the permanent homes survive winter in Colorado if they take up residence in a tree cavity or structure? They can, okay, but in the absence of any management, they don't survive more than 2 winters typically. So we do have issues with something called a varroa mite, which is an exoparasitic exoparasitic mite. Okay, so it's on the outside of the bee, not on the inside of the bee. And these mites will kind of overrun things if you don't do anything to manage them. And so typically they in the wild, there really hasn't been this massive development of resistance or even tolerance to these mites. And so they will succumb to them in the course of a couple to 3 years. I would say that most of what we see in trees came from a managed hive in the first place. I really don't think that we have any quote unquote wild bees left here anymore. Out of all of the swarms that I caught last year, I had 1 that was actually from a wild hive. And she swarmed, and I could see, it happened to be on a property where I also keep managed hives at, and I just set the hives in place like 2 days before that, and the homeowner calls me and says, oh, these hives swarmed, and I'm like, just bitching at my husband all the way down there, why would those hives swarm? I just put those hives in there. They have plenty of room, blah, 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 blah. And I get down there and I'm looking all over where the hives are, and there's no bees there, so I text the guy and go, hey, Pat, there's no swarm here. He says, yes, there is, as I can see it. I'm looking out my front door. Well, they were about 100 yards down his driveway. Well, then I knew that they didn't come out of my hives because they'll almost always go somewhere very close to where they emanate from. And so I started looking around, and sure enough, there's this giant cottonwood on this ditch, and I can see all the activity from the original hive where they were at. So then I caught those bees. I happened to keep those bees on the roof of the Denver Botanic Gardens, and so they really struggled last year. They had a disease called European foul brood, and we got them out of that, and they just hadn't built up very big at all. But they were super interesting because they were incredibly efficient. So all of the hives were in double deep boxes, and except for that one was in a single box. She was quite small, and I put a feeder on her so that she had some extra resources. And I put the feeder on there, and when I checked them, she never touched it. It was just all turned to rock candy. It's because the feeder just has sugar water in it, so it had all gotten out of solution, turned into a giant rock of sugar in there. And she came out of the winter with probably 10,000 bees. And she immediately got to building up that hive. She's on double deeps. And now, probably tomorrow, I will have to split her to keep her from swarming this year. So she was really efficient with resources. She was really efficient with bees. And it was interesting to watch her survive the winter. So if we get some wild hives, it would be super cool. Let's see. Alex asked, "What race of honeybee do I keep? Italians or Carniolans swarm more than the other?" I keep mutts anymore. We do buy bees because we're still expanding the apiary, and so we buy bees, and those are typically coming in as Italians. But once those queens move off, then they're going to interbreed. Once they swarm, then you're raising up a new batch of queens, and that new batch of queens is going to be whatever they breed with. So they start getting diluted over time. And I have, I wouldn't say that there's a difference in swarming between carnies and Italians. And carniolans are just a darker bee. But if you look inside a beehive, and in fact, if I look, flip back through the presentation and looked at close up at those bees that are all sitting on top of the inner cover, they would be all different colors. They'd be totally black. They would be black and brown. They would be stripy. It just depends, because since the queen mates with multiple drones, those drone genetics come through, and it does change the color of the bees as the drone genetics come through. Okay. Have I ever seen a package swarm? Well, yeah, if somebody's not paying good attention to a package and they feed the living daylights out of that package, you can actually feed them into a swarm. So you have to have adequate space for them. And when you're feeding them, they are making wax like the devil. And that's the point of feeding them. And so if you have put on a feeder and been very diligent about filling it, but not being very diligent about looking at what's going on underneath that feeder, you can actually feed a package into a swarm. Does it happen? Yes. Often? No. Okay. I get probably one a year. Alex, is the building of drones an indication of swarming? No, but it's an indication that the hive is happy and healthy, and that once there are adequate drones in the neighborhood, then that increases the likelihood of a virgin queen being able to be successfully mated. So it does play a role. Okay. Okay, do you suggest treating with OAV, which is oxalic acid vapor, after brood has hatched, or might this damage newly formed queen? Okay, so this is a mite management question, and So this is kind of complicated, and maybe I should, let me just see if we've got adequate time to address this, Eric. And if I do, I'm going to come back to it. Okay. Because it might not be applying to many of the people that are on this webinar. And so we can just get the general questions asked, and we can get the beekeeper questions taken care of at the end. How do I weigh swarms so accurately? I can weigh swarms incredibly accurately for two reasons. Number one, I have weighed the cages and written the tare value of the cages on the top of them, so I know how much the cages weigh. Two, since I am a commercial producer of honey, I have to have scales, and those scales have to be certified by the state and calibrated annually. So I have very accurate scales. So that is the two pieces that allow me to tell you that it was a 13.63 pound swarm from the other day. Okay. Let's see. My 5-year-old is wondering if swarms have a smell. They do. They have a very distinctive smell. I can't describe it. I can just tell you that once you smell it, you will know what it is. Okay. All right. So 10 days apart from someone else's hive, Shauna answered the question. So you had both the prime swarm and you had the after swarm / virgin queen swarm come in to your yard, and they were following this year's pheromone trail. Okay. Alex, this is another beekeeper question. How far away are DCA from the original hive? And so DCA is drone congregation area. And I should probably explain something about how virgin queens mate and who they mate with. So virgin queens are queens that have not been mated. Drones are fertile males, and their only job is to mate with virgin queen. They leave the hives, and when they leave the hives, they go to the bar, which is a really, really great bar that all the queens want to go to on Friday night too. And so all these drones are sitting there in the bar waiting for this virgin queen to walk into the bar. And when she does, then they start trying to mate with her. And she will mate with somewhere between 10 and 30 drones. And when they mate, they will die. And then if they are unsuccessful at mating, they'll go back and hang out in the hive or the hive next door or whatever, and they'll return to the drone congregation if successful. If they are unsuccessful for the entire season, because they do not collect pollen, they do not collect nectar, they do not collect water, they do not contribute to the good of the hive in any other fashion besides genetics, the hive will kick them out and they will die. So as with most bugs, being a male is not a good deal. Okay. So in answer to the question, how far away is the drone congregation area from the original hive? I have no idea. Okay. There are people doing some very good work on this right now, and in particular, Julia Mayhood, who is sits on the pollen. She has been writing articles in the American Beekeeping Journal on. She's tracking drones with drones, and she's getting some really interesting data from that. Drone congregation areas are constant from year to year. Tom Seeley has done quite a bit of work on drone congregation areas and the parameters that the drones are seeking in the formation of those areas. But they are very consistent, and it has a whole lot to do with the kind of like he does all his working in New York where Cornell's at. And so he like how rivers flow and then the altitudinal differences around there. So they are consistent from year to year, which is another one of those things that I find absolutely incredibly fascinating. Is how do all the queens know where to go when they only mate once in their lives, and so they never return there? How does the old queen tell the new queen where to go? I don't think she does. And then since all the drones are dead at the end of the year and a whole new batch of drones gets raised the following year, how do those drones know where to go? But somehow or another, that's all communicated. And people are doing work on that, trying to figure that out. Okay, here's a question about if there's a swarm in our yard, how long would we have to get a hive box and provide them with a new home? Or if we call the swarm hotline, can we keep the hive? I don't know how long you would have. I would tell you that getting a box and throwing bees in it is not beekeeping. Okay. And there's super good odds that they would abscond from that box because it won't meet their criteria that they're looking for. If you call the swarm hotline, we do send beekeepers out there to catch that swarm. Sometimes they will charge you if you want to keep the hive because they have spent the time and they've spent the money and they have are not going to get the bees for their efforts. So it won't be a free thing. But if you are unprepared as a beekeeper, generally speaking, they won't do that. Okay, because keeping bees isn't simple. It's really hard actually, and it's and keeping bees successfully. And so we like people to know something about bees before they try and keep them. And it just enhances your thrill to be able to keep a hive alive. And the only thing that allows you to keep a hive alive is to know what on earth you're doing. And even that's no guarantee. Okay, I lose a ton of hives every year too, and it's not from no management. It's just a complicated world out there, and it's hard to keep them alive. And I have about 130 hives right now, and it's depressing to lose one. But if you only have one hive in your backyard and you lose one, it's really depressing. If you have two hives in your backyard, you only have three possible outcomes every single winter. You have two hives alive, you have one hive dead, or you have two hives dead. That's it, and it sucks. And so it is. It is not for the faint of heart to keep bees, and it's expensive. Okay, so if you think about it, to get bees uh, per hive, including I won't even say including one-shot wonders like suits and gloves and stuff like that, just to get the equipment and the bees themselves is probably going to cost you $200, even if you get the free part in the swarm. So it kind of depends on whether you want a bird in the hand or a bird in the bush, right? You can set up all your equipment and hope that you get a swarm call, but we have less and less swarms every year, less and less swarms every year because of the losses that are going on bees in the general environment. So they are becoming quite a rarity. Okay, so it
Beth,
looks
I'm
like
just
I got
gonna
one
jump,
minute to answer you, Eric.
Beth, I'm just gonna jump in and say we're
Yeah.
coming up on 1 o'clock. So I
Yep.
just want to, you may be willing to stay on a few more minutes. I don't
Yep.
know, but I want to officially thank you for giving us your time and this wonderful wealth of knowledge. And thank you to everybody that attended and for your great questions and participating today. And Beth, if you are willing to take a few more questions, I'll just formally say goodbye to folks. We understand if you have to leave, feel free to come on camera, and we can stay on for a few more minutes.
All right. Yeah. So I thought I would go back to Eric's question. So since I don't remember it, let me scroll back up here. Okay. Treating a hive with oxalic acid vaporization after brood has hatched, or might this damage newly formed queens? Okay. So here we are. We are on, I don't know, 14 days of 75-degree weather. This is great. Okay. It's a perfect time to treat. If you're going to treat for mites. Now, all of that being said, I try to do integrated pest management with mites, since that's what I advocate for people to do in their gardens with pests. And a mite is simply a pest. So, integrated pest management for mites involves several other steps before treatment, in my opinion. Okay. And the first thing that we are doing is brood breaks. Okay. And a swarm is a perfect brood break. So is a split. So you have a swarm that goes, it takes roughly 50% of the bees in the colony. And then once the 50% of the bees leaving the colony, you have to make some assumption that 50% of the mites left with them, right? So you have got half the load of mites that you had previously. You also have half the bees. Then we can do splits, and the same thing holds. Almost always when I split, I will take the old queen. And the reason I'm taking the old queen is because I'm trying to prevent the swarm, because once they are churning the machinery to emanate, a lot of times they'll keep going, but then when they don't have a queen, they go, hey, maybe I'll stick here for a little bit. Okay. And then so it'll stop the prime swarm. Essentially, you took the prime swarm with your split. And then they're hatching out a new one. So right now, all of the splits are hatching out their queens, and I am absolutely not treating them. Okay. And I don't have any data that says that it is going to adversely impact that queen, but my gut tells me it can't be good for her. So why would I do that? So I'm going to wait until those queens are hatched, back in the hive and laying, and cross my fingers and hope I'm still sitting at 75 degrees where I can then treat. What will I be treating with? I will not be treating with oxalic acid vaporization. I don't have great faith in that because there doesn't seem to be equipment that delivers on a large scale, 100 hive scale, a consistent dosage of oxalic acid where I'm comfortable that it's actually efficacious. So I'm going to run formic acid, which is a certified organic product. And I'll use either Mite Away Quick Strips or Formic Pro. I don't like Formic Pro as much as I like Mite Away Quick Strips, because Formic Pro, it looks the same, it acts the same, it's the exact same thing until you go to remove it from the hive a week later, and then it chips, it gets really hard and chips into about 1,000 pieces to extricate it from that hive. Whereas I can just pull out the Mite Away Quick Strip patty. So I've ran tests on Formic Pro and Mite Away Quick Strips, and the efficacy seems to be identical between the two products. But the misery of getting out that patty from the Formic Pro has caused me to give up on that product and move to Mite Away. But then the other thing I do is I run screen bottom boards, and I also run drone comb. Okay, so most mites prefer drone comb because it takes longer for drones to hatch than it does for workers to hatch. So it's 21 days for workers, 24 days for drones, and they can use that extra 3 days that foundress mite is what the mother mite's called. And that foundress mite can use that extra 3 days to get another mite out the door. And she does. And so what I do is they make all sorts of drone foundation and different ways to manage drones, but I think the easiest thing to do is to just put a medium frame into a deep box. And then, since it's a violation of bee space, everything under the medium frame down to the top of the box underneath it is going to be created as drone comb. So it'll be larger cells for drones. And then I just keep an eye on it, and that's critical. Okay, so I'm in the hives every single week, and every single week I keep an eye on and look at that drone comb and see how it's coming along. And when it's capped, I brush all the bees off of it, cut off all that drone comb and feed it to the chickens, and then put it back in there again. Now, you can't put it just anywhere within the hive. So if I never put it in the bottom box. I always put it in the top box because I don't want to be dealing with it in the bottom box every week. So in the top box, there are 10 frames because I'm running 10 frame deep equipment. And I call the center frames, I have numbers for all of them so I can describe things. So the center 2 frames in the top box are 11 and 12. And then the edge frames in the top box are 19 and 20. And I use the left side for odds and the right side for evens, counting from the center. So when I put the drone comb into